economic growth, part 5. Talk quickly about green growth here. And this is the idea of sustainable development, that growing an economy just to grow an economy makes no sense if it undercuts the environment and natural resources that we depend on every day, whether it's ecosystem services, biodiversity, the web of life, all the things that are interconnected. 1,000 years ago, we worried about nature killing us. Even 200 years ago, life expectancies were a lot lower because nature had the upper hand. These days, we have the upper hand on nature in many ways, not in all ways. This Mullen fire here in Centennial is one ways that we try to control nature, but nature is controlling us. But the idea is, how do we measure green growth? How do we measure green GDP? How do we understand all these environmental services and which are not priced by the market? And that's the key difference here, is when we talk about GDP, all those are marketable goods and services. There's a quantity, there's a price, there's supply, there's demand, there's a private market, and rents and rewards go to those who take a risk. For environmental goods and services, there's not really a market. I mean, you can buy land, you can conserve land, you can set land aside, but when the atmosphere provides little air pollution, who pays for that? We ask firms to account for it. So somehow, to get an idea of green growth, we have to figure out how to not so much think about just consuming for consuming's sake, but consumption and conservation. So the idea here, when we think about a green economy, we're thinking about economic growth, environmental sustainability, social development can be part of it, because education is always part of understanding both human-made objects and nature, and how they intermingle and how they interact. And we want the idea of an inclusive green economy that both reduces poverty and inequality and sustains inclusive growth. I mean, those are huge targets. The US is a winner-take-all society, no doubt about it. At the same time, we spend a lot on, especially, you think of a state like Wyoming, which is 50% public lands, 50% private lands, how much we spend on the national forests, on our prairies, our grasslands, on our national parks. And so we're trying to figure out a measure to say this is considered a good economy, both in terms of its ability to produce goods and services of high quality and its ability to protect nature and all the goods and services that are not priced by the marketplace. Right? So the overall goal then, when you think about this idea of planetary boundaries, we do have constraints. There is no planet B, right? The overall goal being sustainable, prosperous, and equitable well-being, right? And so you got basic human needs, and you've got subjective well-being, and you've got sustainable development, again, how you balance and employ capital assets, which we talked about before, which can include natural, built, human, social assets, all these different forms of capital that feed into our ability to have both wealth, financial wealth, and the wealth of nature, right? So there's the wealth of nations, and then there's the wealth of nature, and how do you account for that? In the old days, we did, because there was more nature than there were people. Nowadays, the amount of people and the amount of nature is leading to questions of whether we are exploiting nature too much. Are we deforesting too much? Are we digging up too many minerals? Should we figure out how to use renewable energy instead of non-renewable fossil fuels? All these questions come into play. And one measure is what's called genuine progress. So instead of doing GDP, there's something called the genuine progress indicator. So that would include GDP as part of the problem, or as part of the measure of progress, but also 20 more additions and subtractions to account for, like volunteer work, cost of divorce, crime, pollution, biodiversity, ecosystem services. So essentially, what we're doing is taking GDP, which is just the value of goods and services, and we're expanding that to try to include non market impacts. Now, these 20 additions and subtractions are, I mean, you can imagine things that are of value to you that don't have a price. You can think of things that are of negative value to you that don't have a price. You know, when you're thinking about air pollution and you go to a big city like Mexico City and there's a lot of air pollution. Well, there's no price for that air pollution right now. And so, how do you account for it? Right? And so, if you look at genuine progress, the indicator, and you look at it compared to gross domestic product, we can see by this graph here the idea that even though GDP is going up, our per capita income is going up, we look richer. Genuine progress suggests we're actually no better than we were many years ago. You know, these last few decades have been flat because of the additional air pollution, the additional social disruption, the additional inequality that exists. And so this gap then between the blue line of GDP and the red line of this genuine progress indicator suggests that we need a different way to think about what economic growth means. We need a broader way to think about it, and we need to think about this notion of a green GDP, okay, or in this case, a genuine progress indicator. Because if we've got more money to spend, but our lives are not really much better off, what's the point? What's the point of having extra money if you're miserable? Okay, so to summarize Lecture 5, economic growth is the key. It determines our ability to create wealth and income, and also to destroy things of value if we're not keeping track of them. It's the key to public policy. Politicians are always arguing for more economic growth because they can understand that figure, and people understand that figure because it means more disposable income. And productivity is the key to economic growth. Sorry about the typo. Full stop. Output per worker is the key to growing GDP. Now, again, if you believe in sustainable development, that may not translate into genuine progress. All right, so economic growth, though, can obviously be good. More disposable income, more ability to do the things you want to do means better standard of living, higher well-being. It's not always 100% true, though, if it creates these downsides of affecting the environment in extremely negative ways, or if it creates these wealth inequalities such that you've got 1 billion people living on $1 a day. Now, you can say, well, that's their choice. Maybe yes, maybe no. And that it will be Lecture 6 when we get into depth about this idea of inequality and whether inequality is our fault. Is it the fault of the people who are poor? Is it the fault of the institutions which are rigged so that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer? We'll go into that the next lecture.